I want to make sure I record for us, but thanks everybody for coming. The first thing I want us to do today is talk about the inventory and analysis that we started at the end of last week and had the opportunity to work on this week to kind of give you opportunity to kind of share and learn a little bit about what you've discovered with your landscape. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of show you that inventory and analysis, the digital one. I did it digitally, so it makes it easier for me to share with you all, which made it interesting. So it's a little different than compared to how it usually looks. But nonetheless, I want to show this with you all to kind of show what I worked on and what I learned from doing my inventory and analysis and how it can end up informing my decisions. So I'll share mine, allow you to ask questions, but then I want to break you all out into just 2 small breakout groups. So then you all can have just like a small little discussion, and I'll break out into those groups and kind of listen to what you all are talking about. So it can be more peer moderated. Is that okay? Wonderful.
What would you do if we said no?
That's true. You'll have to sit in here and wait, Mary. So let's see. So let me open up my inventory analysis. So mine, I broke up into like 2 quick maps. And I have my annotate tool, so I can kind of draw on top of this. So let me actually zoom in to this screen to make it easier, but you all can see my map. Okay, wonderful. So now let me get, where's my draw tool? All right. So some of the things that I noted when I looked at my inventory was just kind of like, what's happening in my yard, how, the landscape, how's it being used? Like, you know, what we mentioned is just taking this inventory, and then that analysis part is the so what, why is it important, or how could it influence the design? So what I did on here is I decided to go and to share with you all is like where the different rooms are within the house. So you can kind of, it can be informative knowing, because you could have different, you might want to have different types of views looking out a window, or have different types of security plantings in front of other types of windows. So really the what's happening inside the house can really inform what's happening outside as well. So I went ahead and I marked all that information about inside the home. And then what I did is I just kind of walked around the property, taking note of some of the things. So I looked around the property, on this side of the property, like right here. It's an iffy view. There's a big shadow box fence that goes around the property, but sometimes the neighbors can be a little bit loud because they have like a motorcycle and stuff like that. So so I might have to think, okay, is there some way that I can do a sound buffer or barrier to help minimize sound interference? On the other side, we have a poor view, but it's obstructed already. This big box right here, that's actually a podocarpus hedge. It's about 15 feet tall. So really we can only see our neighbor's house from like this portion of the property. So we have our trees, but one thing that has happened that I noted in the inventory as well is, starting here, we have shade throughout the day. Even though it's on the south side of the home, the big podocarpus hedge puts a lot of shade in this area. And it's dappled sunlight, but I started to think, okay, it's shade throughout the day and it drains really well because it's very sandy. So I might end up doing some plant material that like well-drained soils and have shady and prefer those shadier conditions. One thing that's important to note is I have a dry well that I put onto this property here to kind of catch a lot of the rain that's coming off of the home. It goes to an underground pipe and into a big dry well. So I wouldn't really want to put anything on top of that other than just like short little ground covers. So this little parking area, that's the main parking, and there's an unpaved natural driveway right here. So obviously I'm not going to want to put anything there. Our secondary parking that's paved. There's an existing liriope bed, and water sheet flows across the site pretty much in front of the house in this direction, kind of heading north. It still drains really well, but when there's all the water that comes in, I know that there's going to be a lot of water draining this way. So I might need to think about how that can impact my design. This whole area in the front, it has partial shade throughout the day. It doesn't, in the morning, you might get a little full sun, but because of the canopies that's happening around the property, it kind of gives it a dappled sunlight. This is actually, this tree is actually a, oops, is actually a live oak. So it's a big live oak that kind of envelops it's in the right of way property line across the street, but it covers a big portion of the property. So we get a lot of that afternoon sun or shade that comes from that, but then we get some shade from these other larger canopy trees. So there is this double gate here. So the idea, how we want to use the yard, this will be like a storage area because we have like a little pop-up trailer, and that's where it's going to be sitting. So we need to make sure that we have ease of entry and exit on this side of the property through these double gates. Going into the backyard, it's pretty basic. It's all open. We do have these different rocks that I ended up marking that are in the backyard. And this area in the sun here is pretty much full sun throughout the day, and it drains really, really quickly. And actually get pretty brutally hot in the day in this section. And then on this back part of the property, we have this like wooded or uncleared lot. It's a decent view, but you might see some invasive species kind of pop up here and there. But with regards to thinking about something that's more natural or a wooded area, can kind of lend itself to being a good view for the backyard. So that is the inventory. So it's just kind of, okay, so this is what exists. And the analysis, let me go ahead and clear all of that. The analysis portion, let me go to my next page. Oh, I'm already here. All right, here we go. So this is a lot of the same content, but I'm just like, okay, so what? What does it mean? Let me pull the annotate up. Okay, so up here we'll start, because of the sound issues, maybe some type of shrub or hedge row along the property line that can help act as a sound barrier between us and then the neighbor, but make sure that we maintain access in this space so we can get in and out of that back property. So one thing I put in is like maybe remove this existing liriope bed and expand the entire ornamental bed, and I can reuse those liriope in other areas. So with regards to that drainage area that I was talking about, I could allow for, make sure I still allow for that drainage. I don't impede upon it, so I don't have any unintentional flooding. But I could potentially add some gutters on the house to help catch some of the storm water, and I could put them in French drains and help them like drain out in the main lawn space. So that's like a big project, but there are ways to help minimize flow or reduce flow. So thinking about making sure that the water can still move without impeding it is going to be important. So in this front area, I want to, maybe I'll expand the beds. It's not a big activity area, but there's too many power lines for more trees because that's what all these blue lines are for, and also these utilities. So I may not need any more trees unless I do small shrubs or small trees, large shrubs, just as accent, but still kind of keep this area relatively, reducing that lawn area and increasing the planting bed will reduce maintenance, expand the bed, but also add a bit nice visual character to the landscape. So moving back down here, maybe add some additional shrubs to help block the rest of the view within this right of way to this poor view that's over here. Include the shade loving plants to within this space, and avoid planting on top of the dry well, which I kind of mentioned. So this whole area is more of a utilitarian area. It's lower use. So this would be very, very simple. I may not even touch it. Just because it's what's growing there right now is doing well. So I'm not going to put a lot of effort into that area since it's going to be like, I'm pulling stuff in and out of the shed. So like a lawnmower, string trimmer, other equipment I might have, I'll move it in and out here. So I keep that basic and simple. But this area, since it's the full sun, maybe a good turf grass area, but that becomes that main activity area. And we use this door a lot to come in and out of the backyard because that is our main access to the backyard. So this becomes that primary entertainment space. So, we can sit here and look out over the backyard and kind of watch the kids run around, because that's going to be kind of how we use the space, is create space so the kids can play, but also we want to add some ornamental value. So to help add the ornamental value, it's not written on here, but adding plant beds along here to kind of hide the AC a little bit. You still need to make sure it's open, but also kind of protect people from these rocks. The rocks can be really nice, but you don't want them to be a trip hazard within a landscape. So these big stones that are kind of on the edge here, they are annoying, but what I could do is I can use them to my advantage to kind of create that bed edge. So then that bed edge that could potentially run through here, I'm drawing with a trackball mouse, so it's kind of squiggly, but those rocks become accent features or ornamental features as part of the landscape bed, and I can fill in maybe all around it and behind it with different types of plant material. But also lastly, I want to preserve that view to the wooden area. So maybe use low, medium shrubs to kind of make sure I'm not blocking that natural view. No use to put in some large trees when I got some large trees growing back here that add a good view. So that's a very simple analysis. And do y'all have any questions about what I showed as part of this? So it's just a matter of just what am I looking at and what does it mean? Do you have any questions? All right.
Hey,
So,
Taylor,
yeah.
so is there a version of that software that you just use that's available to us if we're not professionals or?
Let me see. So I usually do this all by hand.
Uh-huh.
I never do anything on the computer until
Okay.
I have to turn something over to the client. Um, so I'm just doing it on here as part of just be able to demonstrate it easily to
Okay.
you all.
Well,
But there are some, I think AutoCAD might actually have, or Autodesk might have a very limited free version of their software, but there's another one called Smart Draw, I think is free. I'd have to look.
okay.
So I'd have to look. So yeah. But usually my planting plans are just chicken scratch on trace paper.
That looks very professional.
I'll even go into the field with it. So, because like you didn't pay for construction documents, so I'm not going to make them. So this is the quick inventory and analysis that I had. So you can see it's a what exists, what does it mean, or how can it impact or influence my design. So I'll go ahead and stop share. Did any of you start to see, before I should break us out into those breakout rooms, did any of you start to see anything in your inventory and analysis that you're like, oh, that's interesting, and I never even really thought about it before?
Putting the views from inside the house.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And
See, like Lance has a great view out his window. That's a cool view. So you don't want to block that.
the treating each one as a zone and looking at the different parts. So like as I said, this was perfect timing because I wanted to quote redo my yard, but looking at the front and saying, okay, not just the view, how much light there is, what's the slope, treating that step instead of trying to look at the whole thing, looking at each of the zones as a zone. So that just itself was kind of a an eye opener piece. And I will tell you, I didn't even know I had dwarf yaupon until I really got over into my bed, and I've got 6 of those. So
Oh, nice.
I'm going to move them out somewhere and trim down and use as a border. So
Wonderful. Nanohollies are wonderful, adaptable, strong natives. Yeah. So all Yopons, I like those. I want someone to have I wonder if someone has a Yopon garden where it's just all the different forms of Yopons.
well, I didn't know it was a holly until I just always called it dwarf yaupon. You say yaupon, I thought it was yaupon anyway, the different ones. But yeah, I saw where you can actually, I've never had berries on it, which I now see is because it's only the female plant. But anyway, I didn't even know it was an edible thing other than to use as medicine.
Yeah. So I want to eat the fruits, obviously, like
Yeah.
with any other holly, but it's used for tea. Yeah. It
Yeah.
has ethnobotanical use. Yeah.
Yeah.
So what else did you all see? And I know, like, when I put you on the breakout group, I want you all to talk about it and share what you have. That might even elicit some more thoughts. But anything else before I put you in the breakout groups? So let's go
Can we
ahead.
talk some more about Yopon holly?
Yeah, we'd always talk more about Yopon holly. We'll run out of time, though.
There's a company called Yopon Brothers, and they're producing the tea and selling it online.
Yeah,
So it's easy
and
to remember Yopon Brothers, and it's good tea.
yeah, you can find it
High
locally
quality.
sold too. I think Life on Plastic sells it, and I think Ward's has it. So, but anyway, so let's go ahead and I'll put you in the breakout rooms. I'll just do it automatically. So you'll get a little pop-up that says, "Would you like to join breakout room?" And you just say yes. So, and I think I can move you all over there too. So they're all open. So go ahead and move into your rooms.
I think generally we all have too much stuff. We all need to clean out a little bit, reorganize. I know specifically for me, that's my biggest job now, is to get it cleaned out.
Yeah, and there are ways that we could talk about, and we'll talk about today, that are great ways to help just using a lot of the plant material you'll have now, but defining spaces a little bit more can really help make a space more uniform, even with a very, very diverse plant selection. And that's common, especially if we have older landscapes that we're retrofitting. I'm pretty lucky because my yard was completely just not managed at all in the past. So before we bought it, they cleared a lot of it out or redid a lot of it just to make it more sellable. So I have more of a blank canvas than most people, which is really nice. So what's another big thing? So it was Mary's, from Mary's group. Greg, what's something that you all talked about? And you're muted.
Oh, there we go.
Well, it was interesting in that 4 people with 4 pretty divergent needs and plans. Nikki's moving to a new place. I think Jan hasn't been at her place long, and she's got a lot of alterations to make. Judy, it sounds like she's doing a property for someone else. So that's taken on quite a challenge. And we have the removal of 2 large laurel oaks and ripping up all of our ground cover in the front yard because of skunk vine. So just interesting how different everybody's landscape challenges were.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And that's one thing I really like about design is that creative thinking for problem solving and using science to kind of help explore those different solutions for us. And you know, and in the situations you're mentioning, Greg, you know, when we're thinking about how landscapes change, whether it be gradual or very quickly, and in this case, your landscape changed completely because you had some trees recently taken out. So you went from having shade conditions in some areas to having substantially more sunlight within that landscape. So some changes can be very dramatic, planned or non-planned or unplanned. So anyways, so now that you kind of have that background, that little bit of inventory and analysis, you can still work through this and learn more about your landscape. Now what I want us to do is I want us to go ahead and we're going to talk about the, where's it at? Is it this one? All right. So this is the elements and principles of design. So we're going to start talking about the foundations of what design is. And when we start thinking about how do you design, you know, it's really start to talk about how do things start to fit together? How do they work together? How do you create order within a landscape? And, you know, that kind of goes back to what Mary was talking about is if you have a kind of a diverse collection of plants, how do you start to design that landscape so it kind of has more uniformity to it or more order that is given to it? And these are going to be some of these main ideas. There's a very diverse list of these elements and principles, but we're just going to hit on the main key ones. So elements and principles, I break them down to these two different areas. The elements are the different tools available to designers, and the principles are essentially the instructions and guides to use those tools. So it's kind of like every IKEA set that you get. You buy something from IKEA, it comes with an Allen wrench. That's your element, and the principles are those instruction manuals on how to put things together. So the elements and principles of design, I call this the designer's toolbox. So anyways, we'll go through all of these and I'll show some cool examples of what you can see. So the elements are going to be line, form, texture, color, and visual weight. Now, once we get done going through all these, you're going to start walking around landscapes or your gardens or anywhere that you spend time throughout the week, and you're going to start seeing these different elements used throughout the community. So line, form, texture, color, and visual weight are the 5 elements of design that we'll talk about. And again, a lot of this, you already have these slides available to you, as well as those publications that I sent to you even goes into further information on some of this on some of these elements. So the first one is line. Line defines form. So line is relatively two-dimensional, but you have the ability to put lines together to create polygons or different shapes. So the lines define form and create patterns. They direct an eye. They can direct movement throughout a different space. Typically, when we look at a straight line, it's very structural, very geometrical. But if we start to look something that might be a little bit more curvy, it gives it more natural look and natural feel to it. So we can find lines in bed lines. That's the most common space. Like, how do you define a bed? Hardscape patterns or hardscapes, as well as just the outlines of plants themselves. So when you look at this image on the right, where does your eye go?
Back.
Yeah, that line specifically takes your eye to that background of the image. And if you were standing in that space, what would you do? What would you feel like doing in that space?
Walking.
Yeah, you would want it pulls you back there. It evokes exploration. You know, you don't always see what's ahead. Now this is pretty large scale that you can see this, but that line it evokes movement. So, and it directs that eye, and you can easily do that within a landscape. Is where do those lines converge? Where do they diverge from? Or how do they move around the landscape to kind of create different spaces? Another thing about looking at that line is it moves your eye to that background. It evokes movement, but also, what's that shape of the line? Is it that strong structural line, or is it more organic and free flowing?
Organic.
Yeah. So that lends itself to complement the setting or that context. So that organic line in a very natural setting kind of puts them together. Now imagine in your mind's eye, I'm going to ask you a lot to use your imagination in this discussion. Imagine your mind's eye how different this would look if it was a straight line like a sidewalk. You know, would that feel different in that space?
It would probably look out of place.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Now, it would be a very high contrast. It wouldn't necessarily fit. Now, there are times, though, where, yes, you want things to kind of fit or pair well together, but sometimes contrasting elements you can use to your benefit. But we'll talk more about contrast in a bit. But anyways, so line, it's the very first part of all designs. It starts with the line, and you're, you know, well, technically, you have points. How you connect points together, you form lines. And when you start to create different lines, you create different forms and shapes. But line is a very basic part of all landscape design, or just all design in general. So here's some examples of where you can see lines. So on that top left image, where are you seeing line within that picture?
The top.
Everywhere.
In the hedge.
Yeah, the
Yeah.
shape.
Yeah,
Mhm.
square.
So that's very, now, of course, we're not doing parterres like this. This is actually, I believe that's taken in France, because that's a commonly practiced with those parterres.
Yeah, like the Garden of the Tuileries, actually.
Yeah, so it's very, it is strong geometric shape, which actually makes things look a little bit more formal. So yeah, but we also see lines in that vertical elements of the trunks. You see lines that is that pathway, as well as the lines of like those fence and railings that you see. So there's a bunch of different lines throughout there, but you can create and control line placement, how you're using it. And in this case, or one of the examples is you're pruning those trees and incorporating more geometric shapes to it. What about the bottom left image?
It's natural looking, more natural.
Yeah, very curvilinear.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So what's creating the lines?
Bricks.
Mm-hmm.
The bricks, the hardscape are creating the lines.
Yeah. So the bricks are defining a line, but if you look at it, you know, the ground cover, it looks like a heterohelix, that is reinforcing that line shape, as well as the turf in itself is reinforcing that line shape. So, but that kind of creates a really nice juxtaposition. Is you have like the turf grass area, you have that dense ground cover, and you have a really strong line that kind of helps define those two spaces. And they're using that brick as a easy way to help define edges. I think using bricks to define plant bed edges is actually really nice. So I really like the soldier bond method, but that requires a lot more methods. That's bricks. That's where you're placing them vertically versus horizontally. So, and what about the image on the right? Where are you seeing line in that one?
That's fabulous. Everywhere. I mean, the bricks have it, the bench has it. I mean, it's nice.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's lines everywhere, and you can see how those lines create form, right? They define that space, and that kind of jumps us into that next section is form. It's just the three-dimensional series of lines that define space. And they can really influence scale. how large or how small a space feels. But form is the most enduring quality of all plants. Like when you think of a weeping willow, what do you think of?
The arch.
Yeah, you think of its shape. That's its form. So all plants have certain forms. Like that's like that weeping form. Some plants might have round forms, and are just following on the ground. So that's just within the plant material. So form is most enduring quality of all plant material because colors could change, flowering will change, our flowering periods can be different. But the form can also be manipulated through pruning like we saw in that previous image. But form can be found in plant material, hardscapes, but also voids. So that positive and negative space where you have things that exist and where things don't exist. So sometimes there's ways that we kind of think about when we're creating balance in spaces. It's a balance of positive use and negative use. Kind of like that yin and yang idea. This negative space can help balance that positive space. So that void or open space can be a great tool when understanding form. So looking at form in these images, like in the top left, some of those aloes. No, what am I looking at? Agave. I kept wanting to say yucca. So, but yeah, looking at the agave. So looking at that has a very unique form and shape to it. And then looking in that bottom left image, you know, that form that you're seeing, that negative space or that open circular area. And that looks like a very strong circle, doesn't it? Very strong geometric. You know, going back to those straight lines versus curvilinear lines, imagine how different that space would look like if it was like more rectangular, or how different it would look if it was more curvilinear. So like a bunch of different curves that kind of define that space. So you can see how just that shape and using that negative space can be a great way to understand form. And it doesn't have to be turf grass. It could be to create that negative space. It could be ground cover. It could be a water feature. It could be an open mulch space. It kind of just breaks up that, that ornamental space. And on the image on the right, there's a bunch of different forms, but what do you see?
Fence. I see the fence.
Yep.
You've got your mixture, right? I think the stairway draws my eye, then the fence, but then you've got those mounds on the left and the right and above that soften it. So, and then that tree at the top. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that form of that tree, I absolutely love. Oh man, I want that out my back door, just like they have. I just want this house. I'll take it.
It's probably going down to the beach if we look the other way.
I know. Behind us is probably like the Pacific, you know.
Yeah.
I imagine Southern California based off of the image that I'm seeing. This image was pulled out of a magazine. I can't remember where it's from, but yeah, you all mentioned all the different forms. The stairs have unique forms. The fence has a unique form. The house, the tree, all the different plant material create different forms. And you know how earlier we talked about contrast can kind of can be used to your advantage. Like look at those boulders that are hiding within the plant material. You know, those pop out and they're used strategically because they have a very coarse texture compared to the very fine texture plants that are all around. And we'll talk about texture in a bit. But anyways, so that's form. So texture, talk about texture in a bit, is the next slide. So texture is really just like surface quality. It's like how your eye is perceiving texture. I know it sounds really weird because when you think about texture, you might think about something that you're eating, something that you're feeling, whether it be for your hands or your feet as you're walking around, but also your eye will perceive different textures as well. So texture we define as just like that surface quality, tactile, so touching, or visual, how you're looking at it. But providing a variety of contrast of textures can really help emphasize different spaces or create uniformity of spaces. We usually break it down as coarse texture, which is like, when you look at something, it's like, oh, that's very coarse texture. Where do you think you see a coarse texture? And it's also into the eye of the beholder as well, but where do you see coarse texture in this image?
Those little stepping stones seem coarse to me. They seem, whereas
Yeah.
the grass
It's like a
seems very
zipper.
soft. Yeah,
Yeah, and the grasses are more of what that like fine texture, aren't they?
yes, yes.
Yeah, and then the medium texture is the stuff that kind of falls in between.
Mhm.
So welcome to design, the world of subjectivity. So so texture, yeah, so that the stone that, like Greg mentioned, looks like a zipper, is
Cool.
very coarse texture in contrast to that fine texture grasses that are surrounding it. So it's using textures to kind of define space and also kind of create that line, that flow, because that pathway is evoking movement, and it really stands out because of that fine texture. So we see different textures in plant material choice, as well as that hardscape material, like y'all pointed out. So here's some more examples. So on the left, we see some fine texture plants are complements and reinforces color and form. So you're seeing on these plants, you see a lot of, on the left image, you see a lot of fine texture plant material. So look how soft those grasses are. There's some Japanese maples in there. There's a couple like a little bit more coarse plants. So like those plants with the larger leaves will typically define as more of a coarse texture.
Those are kind of-
Yeah, they do look like a hosta. I don't know if it is or not, but yeah, same type of form, structure to it. But then that really coarse texture in that image on the left comes out from the what?
bromeliads.
Well, it's still looking at the left image. Where do you see
okay.
more of that coarse texture?
The rock.
Rock.
Yeah, absolutely, the rocks. So that's done purposely. It's like, oh, we have this very coarse texture of these rocks, but those fine texture plants end up complementing it. And then they reinforced it with that color and that form, so that green, just uniform color. Now, of course, in the fall time, because of plant choice, it's going to change. But if we look at the image on the right, the coarse textures have become more dominant in that image based off of a couple reasons. So a lot of it is the leaves, but also big, bold colors like those reds and that yellows and that orange can evoke a very strong, coarse texture. So large leaves, bold colors can give that visual weight or that more coarse idea of plants.
What are those red plants?
Those are actually cordyline. So
I always forget what those are.
Yeah,
I love those.
So now looking at some others, this is looking at some high contrast on the image on the left. This is a kind of a tricky one. This one always kind of mixes people up, and I love, it's usually 50-50 on how people interpret it. But when we're looking at the hardscape surface, what's the fine texture?
The water.
The hardscape, the smaller rocks that make up the center of the flower. Oh, and the small rocks between the big flagstone.
Gravel, yeah.
Yeah. So this is where this one kind of gets kind of tricky, because yes, the smaller stones have more of a they are smaller in how they're laid out. They do kind of create a fine texture element to them, but there is going to be some people that'll argue that because of it being stone and how it's placed together, it has a much more rough surface to it. So that becomes more coarse, and those big stones, because they look more smooth, become more fine texture. Oh, yeah. So so like I see Lance shaking your head. Is that how you interpreted it? Yeah.
Yes, completely. The large flat stones were the fine, and the center was the coarse to me.
Yeah. So you can see how it really falls into the eye of the beholder when you're making these selections with, and this image is always a trippy one, but it's kind of that black dress, blue dress discussion that people have on social media. But Nikki, you hit the nail on the head when you mentioned the water. That fine texture of the water really softens it up. And that, I think, is a really cool element as part of that design. But also, if you look at the plants in the background, there's also a very fine texture in the plant selection as well.
And they mimic it. The grasses mimic the water, the fountain, you know.
Purple fountain grasses, a fountain. Yeah. So, and then the image on the right, we see now, we don't recommend doing this. Do not do xeric landscaping where it's just the rocks like this. But in this image on the right, it shows a very high contrast between the turf grass, that voided space, that's a fine texture, and the coarse texture, which is all that stone that's around it. So that's just showing how that textures can, again, relate to one another. So you could theoretically have one landscape, one plant is coarse texture, but in the next, that same plant, in the next design, that same plant could be considered a fine texture. So it really depends on the context and how it's being used among the other plants or the other material selections that are going on around it.
Taylor, is that being used a lot now? It seems like in our neighborhood, we have 4 or 5 houses where they've used they've used the rock and put plants in around.
So we don't recommend people doing that in Florida. That's not considered Florida friendly. What can happen is the stones can actually heat up the soil, and it can actually kill a lot of the microorganisms within the soil. And it can actually, it heats up the soil, so you have water loss that occurs with it. So evapotranspiration rates, so your soil's not holding on water. So it's a lot of bad things. And then also it doesn't control weeds like mulch do, traditional mulch. So no, I know people do it, but it's not a recommended practice at all. It's great if you live in Arizona. But that's a very good question, Mary, because that's very common that people install landscapes like this. And it's because, I want a very drought tolerant landscape. So I do something that I see like in the desert Southwest, those xeric landscapes, but they don't work contextually well here because even though we like drought tolerant plants, we still have a lot of water that we have to manage.
There's like, 4 or 5 that have done that in our neighborhood recently. And the ones that have been in there about a year are not near as pretty as they were when they started. I think they don't.
They just wait until all the weeds start popping up and all the rocks, and it's impossible to control. They'll go crazy. So yeah.
Maddening.
So next, let's talk a little bit about color, because obviously all landscapes you're going to use color. That's important. So color, it's the hue of the plants. How do you get from flowers, the leaves, you name it. But you can also get color from hardscapes, garden elements. You can bring color in anywhere to help add interest to any landscape. But color also has a really cool perception of how it can impact us psychologically and not necessarily physically, but psychologically. It can completely dictate and change how we're perceiving a landscape. So that's a really cool thing. I'll talk a little bit about that. And so texture affects perception of distance and scale. But I think I need to update that slide. That's not correct. But anyways, so that goes into another part. But plant color. So looking at contrasting elements of where you can have bold color and contrasting to help kind of draw your eye. So on that image to the left, what's the first thing you saw?
The grass.
The yellow, feather, whatever it is.
Yeah, and that was done as a contrasting because it's at more of that light green color. Look how contrast of an element that it is. And then also the texture of it. Can really that contrasting texture can draw your eye to it, because there's a little bit more of those coarse to medium texture, coarse texture and medium texture plants surrounding it. And you have this really fine texture grass that has a contrasting color. It's going to attract your eye. The image on the right, this can really show like how you need to use color tastefully. So obviously you can bring in colors in all different ways, but imagine how different the space is. So there's a lot of blue, right?
Yes.
Yellow is the complementary color of blue. So so that's why you have yellow in here, because they pair very well together. So, but now in your mind's eye, flip this, turn the blue to yellow and the yellow to blue. How different does that space feel? It's a very obtrusive color, you know, that's a lot of yellow to bring into a space like that. So usually there's some colors that they're great to use, but use them only as accents to create emphasis or to create that contrast. Another great example is Florida colors, the blue and orange. A lot of orange will make your eyes go crazy, absolutely crazy. Blue is, I mean, that's a very bold blue in that image on the right, but blue is a very calming color. It's a very soothing color. And then you can accent it with a little bit of orange and it has really good balance. But if you would just do all orange and a little bit of blue, you know, really thinking about how they work together. But the color that you choose can be important with regards to at least providing emphasis, or you can just have all the colors that you want. It really comes down to what you want for your landscape design. But you can find it in all sorts of things. So, you know, like I mentioned, the hardscape, outside of the plants, the hardscapes, stones, pavers, woods, furnitures. So looking at the image on the left, what are the colors that we're seeing?
The yellows.
A lot
the
of
green.
yellow.
Oh, and the green and white contrast in the front.
Absolutely. And one thing that I really like about this is that red, the use of the red in that image. So there's a lot of yellow, but the red frames that walkway or that stepping up to the dining table where you have the red chairs. I really like those, like red geraniums and those little raised plotters. They frame that walkway. You go up to where those red chairs are. So that using that red as a contrast to yellow kind of shows a hierarchy, or a term that we use, hierarchy. So that sitting area or the dining area kind of has more importance than that the sitting area below. What about the image on the right? It has a way to, colors can dictate kind of what we think about a space. So when you look at this image, these color choices, where do you think this would be located?
Yeah, like Arizona.
Out west, yeah.
Yeah. So lots of, because like the textures of the building, it's kind of like the Adobe stucco type color. But yeah, absolutely. You can use color choice to kind of evoke a specific mood or style that can create a neat little theme.
Nice. That's pretty.
So visual weight. So visual weight, that is kind of like that heaviness of colors that you can do. So these are dyed blue. I don't think you can actually buy them blue. You might be able to. That'd be really cool. But visual weight comes down to, I was talking about the use of color to really draw someone's eye to a specific location, using emphasis to attract visually. So visual weight is that ability to capture attention or to disappear, because we can choose plant colors to make things disappear and hide. And that's done through that contrasting. How do we create high contrast is going to attract your eye. Limited contrast is going to make things contrast is going to make things disappear. So that blue, does that have a high contrast or a low contrast?
Low. Yes, me.
So it would be high because of how bold that blue is in comparison to the green. So, and this amazing stonecrop sedums below them. So, so those are the elements. And now I want to kind of, because I want to make sure we get through the principles, but then so we can start talking about the next portion of the design. But now let's talk about principles of design. So we talked about line, the form, we call it texture and color, that visual weight. Those are all great elements of design. So now it's like, okay, how can we start to put these together a little bit? This is those principles of design. So you have scale and proportion, balance, rhythm, unity, and emphasis. So scale and proportion. So scale is the size of a physical dimension, it's a size or physical dimensions, and it creates and defines spaces. Proportion is the size of relative to adjacent objects. So proportion is how big something is compared to something next to it. But typically when we're talking about scale in landscape and garden design, we're putting it into the scale of the human being, because that's who's going to be using it. So looking at scale and proportion of like what we see in plants, the size and scale of individual plants or a mass of plants can vary greatly. Looking at the image on the left, what are some of the thoughts that you might have? Or what do you think of when you look at that image on the left? Does it feel open or enclosed?
Seems a little tight. It seems
Yeah,
small.
cozy.
Yeah, it seems a little closed. What about the one on the right?
It seems bigger because
Yeah,
it seems like you're walking out to a very large space.
Yeah. So plants have the ability to make things feel a little bit more tight or more open. So a great thing to think about is if like you're creating a backyard entertainment area, you want something to say be a little bit more more of an intimate setting where you want, you know, just like a small group of people come. You might want to think about a more of an intimate scale. Would you prefer something that would be a little bit more cozy, or more something that's a little bit more open?
Cozy.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, it depends, I guess.
Yeah, so really thinking about that scale and how plants can kind of create these little more intimate spaces. So if you want to have something that's more of a private, think of how you can use plants to kind of determine that scale to make it seem like a little bit tighter. We can also do that with hardscapes. You know, so I really like these images. So it's usually texture. So there's a lot of texture that's used in these images to evoke scale and proportion. So which of these images, which one looks more enclosed than the other?
The one on the right, because it's got a wall in the back.
Yeah. Any other thoughts?
Well, the framework, the wood outline they have there also serves to give you that feeling of enclosure, even though it isn't.
Yeah. So other great things that, yes, so you can have elements that make it seem a little bit more tight. So sometimes, and this can also go back to that like texture and the eye of the beholder, is when you use fine texture things, it makes things seem more further away. So it can make spaces, it actually makes spaces seem a little bit large. They can make spaces seem a little bit larger, but more coarse texture plants can make, or materials can make things seem a little bit smaller. So if I was choosing plant material and I was putting plants that have, and I have layers of plant material, so things that are close to me and things that are far away, I'll use texture to make things seem larger and smaller based off of just how, just based off of the same size of space, but that plant selection can make it seem larger or smaller. So if I wanted to make a space seem smaller, I would put the coarse texture plant material or materials further away from me and the fine texture plants closer to me. So it makes it seem like those coarse texture plants are larger, so it brings everything in closer to me. Whereas if I put the fine texture plant material further away, it makes it seem like you're viewing plants from a distance. So it pushes everything out a little bit. So that's just using those different variations of texture to help improve or increase a scale of a landscape. Using voids can be important. You know, thinking about how that voids in that open area, the spaces that we're talking about, like the image on the left has that more entertainment area, but on the right, that negative space or that void is that like turf grass area or that lawn space. Of course, the context of which things are sitting. So the image on the left, you know, you have that wall that kind of creates a more of a tight space. But the minute you take away that wall, it opens up that space and it makes it seem much, much larger. But theoretically, we can again take the same size space, and just by doing minor changes in plant selection and visually, we can make those places shrink or grow. So next is balance. So balance, it's a matter, it's visual weight, like is an equal amount of mass. It could be actual or visual about a central axis. So if we look at this picture on the right, you know, which, is there a part of this image that might seem a little heavier to you?
I
If
think they
so,
balance nicely.
say that again.
I think it looks nicely balanced. You've got those things close together on the right. You've got a larger area on the left, but with the large trees, etc.
Yeah, so they do balance themselves out. They complement, because like the building and the built area can be visually very heavy, and they can take up a lot of space, and that can be a heavy space. But on that left side, it can end up balancing it because you're bringing in some of that contrasting elements. It kind of lightens the space a little bit. You know, think about like you're walking through a city, and you know you got these row housing. You know, it can be very, very visually heavy. But then it opens up to kind of like a small park area. It opens up and it balances it out a little bit more, kind of like a scale. So not necessarily a scale, but those opposing differences. And usually we can see some of this, you know, like the symmetrical balance, asymmetrical or symmetrical. Symmetrical gives us a lot more, more of a formal look. Typically when we design things, symmetrical is a little bit easier to design than asymmetrical. But looking at the image on the left, you can see that strong symmetry that's happening through the image. The left side is relatively the same as the right side. There's some subtle differences. But that symmetry creates a really strong formal effect. And the image on the right is just a walkway, but you can kind of see that that plant selection is uniform between the left and the right side of the image. You know, that wall has symmetry to it with the light features upon the top, and the gate adds that symmetrical, and even the walkway, there's symmetry in how they're laying out those pavers. You can see that it's a running bond, but it's six rows essentially, and it's split 3 and 3. So you can see that's very strong symmetry, and that can evoke movement as well. Very strong formal movement. But then we can have that asymmetry. It's a lot more informal, and we can create balance by visual mass of non-equivalent form, size, color, texture, kind of going back to what Jan was talking about in the previous image. But you know, looking at this image, you see that heavy visual weight of the building. Like when I clicked on this image, that was probably the first thing that you saw. But then it kind of seems balanced a little bit by what's happening on the left side of the image with a lot of the plant material, but it's not symmetrical. So with asymmetrical balance, you know, it's not mirrored, but you're kind of creating some type of visual balance between the different parts of the landscape. So otherwise, you know, when you look at it, you can actually feel like you're walking slightly cattywampus. You seem a little sideways when you're walking because psychologically you're driven to that higher weight. So if you're supposed to walk a straight line past this big building in an open field, you would naturally end up curving towards the building, whereas there is a good balance between the building and what's around it. So like in this image, you'd actually end up walking more straight because there is that visual balance it's occurring within the design. So rhythm is a great way to help kind of bring unity throughout a design, throughout a landscape. So it's just repetition. Is it repetition of plant material? That's an easy one to use, is throughout landscape beds, using repetition of similar plants can really help tie everything together. So it creates pattern or sequence, but it helps kind of create that uniformity. But it's important to know that too much repetition can be monotonous, but too little kind of creates confusion. It's kind of like you're in that sweet spot. Is repetition and that rhythm kind of helps tie everything together, but you don't want to make it too monotonous, and you don't want to make sure that it's not reading appropriately. And by not reading appropriately is you're not seeing the rhythm. But we see rhythm in plants, how they're used. Like in the left, the Japanese strolling tea garden, they obviously prune those all. That rhythm is kind of chaotic, but it's based off of that form, how they're pruning all those plants. So it's kind of creating a rhythm. And like in the flower on the right, or sorry, the center, you're seeing rhythm that's created by that gradient of the color change from that dark red to that white. But you can kind of see as you look at that rosette pattern of the petals, you're seeing that color gradation occur from interior to exterior. But then the image on the right, I'm not a big fan of, but it's like you can use repetition in walkways, kind of like in the beds and how those plants look. You see it a little bit better here. You know, that repetition or that rhythm is created by those little turf spots that create that walkway. And in this case, it's evoking movement. And in this image, actually, what does it take your eye to? If you were walking on this, where would you end up going?
To that path beyond.
Yeah.
Garden over.
The little tree at the end.
Yeah, the little tree at the end. And that was done specifically. So like you come to this little walkway, you're going to see that rhythm. It's going to move you just like rhythm does in movement. It kind of pushes you forward to a certain beat. And then that's going to take your eye and you're going to see that that rhythm ends to a visual, something of high visual weight. It's going to become a focal point. Someone's going to look at it and go, oh, and that's what's going to draw them to it. So they're using that rhythm to move that eye to that focal point as well.
There's something amazingly chaotic to that one to me.
In this one?
Yeah, there's something that's just made, to me, it's just chaotic.
So yeah, so this is kind of like that asymmetry and rhythm where it's that walkway is creating that rhythm, but outside of that is just plant them if you got them type of thing. It's just, it's everything that's in there. It creates chaos. And there are some crazy people that are so good at what they do with landscape design and plant selection that, you know, like chaos theory. They design with chaos theory, which is, I can't even understand it from the theory perspective of landscape architecture, but it's kind of like bringing order to pure chaos. And it's kind of neat how they can do that. But yeah, and it's done that purposely. So think about like, we're talking about visual weight and balance. That rhythm is creating order and structure when outside of it, there's a lot of it's informal, more of a naturalistic planting. So you're kind of creating a balance, but also creating a hierarchy of like where, like evoking movement and the control of the eye because it's very contrasting.
And I bet you there's a lot of butterflies and birds in this garden that also add to the chaos, that are all there flitting around and that we don't even, you know, can't take into consideration by looking at a photo.
Yeah. Oh yeah, absolutely. That's the crappy thing about teaching design via images. So, but we can see rhythm in hardscape. I love this image on the left, even though I'd probably get super dizzy and fall over as I walk. You know, it's like you're walking on a Van Gogh painting. But you know, I love how the swirling pattern kind of creates rhythm and evokes movement through there. But also looking at how the steps are used on the image on the right, it evokes movement up to that house. The steps, the repeated patterns brings your eye up to the house and it emphasizes the home rather than the landscape.
What's the material on the left, Taylor?
I think it's just, it's literally just different types of stone, just like river stones, because they're all smooth, and probably just coming from different sources to determine what its color, but it would be, you would hire a artist to do that.
Yeah.
Yes.
So not your typical landscape installation company will do that. So then Unity is just like, if you're a big Lebowski fan, you know, it's the room ties the rug, the rug ties the room together. Unity is what ties the whole landscape together. So unity, it's a theme, it's a style, it's the character that you're seeing throughout the landscape. So even if you have different zones where landscapes, like the plant selections, you have deep shade plants or full sun plants, you can still kind of create unity thinking about how everything ties to fit together in a general theme where they all kind of like blend together in harmony. So that's where you bring in like the different similar forms, textures, colors, shapes, or the lines, and you're bringing them in and using them throughout the landscape. So if you look at this image on the right, what's a uniform, what's something that's kind of tying this image together with regards to design? There's two big things I see.
Circles.
Circles, yeah. The ground, the little raised patio, it's a circle. The little seats are the spheres. You know, the stepping stones leading up to it are circles. The circle that's cut into the wall into the back of that hammock, you know, that crescent. What's the other thing that kind of ties the room together?
Color.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, it's using purple. So when we do color selection, really thinking of like, what's that color palette that I'm using that helps tie that entire landscape together? And then those contrasting elements that you can kind of bring in would draw the eye to a unique spot that you want to look at. So this is a monochromatic color palette where they're using kind of that blue purple color, more purple. So, but you can pick unity in plants. So in this one, it's unity in the plant form. You know, it's like those spike flowers. You know, that is what's creating that uniformity in that plant selection. So you're having uniform in the flowers. And in hardscapes. So how are the hardscapes, how do they kind of create organization framework for a landscape or a garden? So this is a, you know, you see these geometric shapes. So you would think that this garden would be what? More formal or informal?
Formal.
Formal.
Yeah, absolutely. So, you know, on the left side, you have that the ellipse or oval, which is very characteristic of some English gardens. And you have that terrace gardens, a very strong rectangular. So those geometric shapes are kind of creating that unity that's defining more of a formal landscape, or it seems formal, where around it you could have a crazy amount of very diverse plants that are planted like you're in a botanical garden, but that hardscape kind of helps create and define the space. But having unity and variety is really nice. And, you know, unity ties, this goes back to that contrasting element. Unity ties everything together. But when you add in that variety or the specific contrasting elements, it can make things kind of pop out a little bit. Keep moving so we can have get towards the end what we need to. So emphasis. So emphasis is just that focal point. You know, I was talking about contrasting elements. Emphasis, create a focal point. It grabs the eye. What do you want people to look at? How do you get them to look at it? How do you get people to not look at something? That comes back to that visual weight discussion as well. But a focal point is that dominant feature that draws attention and it guides views. There are some gardens that literally that if I put somebody at the very beginning, and it's like a maze, and I can put somebody at the very beginning, and based off of how I do emphasis of plant materials, I can get people majority of the time to walk through that maze without hitting a dead end by just using visual weight and emphasis. And there's some gardens that do that really well, actually. So like the Gardens of Versailles, there is actually a fable garden, like an Aesop fable type garden, where it's a meandering garden in Versailles, but the visual weight and emphasis is what pulls you throughout that entire garden, which leads you through the garden. But it's all done with contrast. You know, you have that unity that's happening throughout the landscape, but then that contrasting element is what you're going to have as being emphasis. So we can create emphasis with specimen plants. That's always a great, easy thing to do and really can become a showstopper. Like I really like the image on the left because the emphasis can come from the trees, that structure of the trees, that vertical element, as well as the yellow flowering plant material. On the image on the right, I mean, you could definitely see what that, where you're getting your emphasis from. I mean, what's the first thing you looked at in that image?
Tree plant.
Yeah. So that century plant that's hanging up there. So that's where your eye immediately goes. So they're using those contrasting elements, big, bold contrast elements, to direct and get your eye to look at specific things. So if there's something that you want to hide, like if you store your trash can somewhere or you have your AC unit, you know, don't put a emphasis plant material around it. Put something that just hides it. But you can also bring in contrast with ornamentals. Like I really like the planters on the left because they are like a very dark, that's a Corten steel planter, but it's a very coarse texture planter and it has coarse texture plants in it. And then compared to that very fine texture ground cover that's all around it that it sits in. And on the image on the right, you know, that statue and the around it kind of becomes more of a coarse texture when you compare all the fine texture plants that are around it. So, and also that fence, isn't it awesome? That woven reed fence. Yeah. So we can't do that in Florida because it'll fall apart within a year. But it's cool nonetheless. So those were the elements and principles. So those are kind of just like the toolbox. It's just like when you start thinking about your design and when you want to start drawing out your ideas, those are the things that just start, I want you to think about. It's like, how do people use the site? You know, do I want symmetry or asymmetrical? Am I going to have a formal or informal garden? What colors do I want to use? What do I want people to look at, or what do I want to look at? That can really emphasize, you know, not emphasize, they can start to really dictate how you might want to end up designing your landscape. So I want us to now talk about that drawing a landscape plan, because this is what I want you all to do. Oh, sorry, before I go into this, is there any questions about this portion? This is the elements and principles is the hardest part of landscape design. It really is, because it gets into the details. You're thinking of things that don't even exist yet. It's really when you start using your imagination a lot to kind of think about what the landscape can become. For professional designers, this is always one of the most difficult portions as well, is those elements and principles. But any questions before we go on to the final portion?
I do have a question.
Yeah.
As far as like what the proportions are, or like rule of thumb of like color palettes that go well, or height differences between different plants, is there a resource for some of those like landscape rules or guidance as far as like proportions and measurements and things like that?
I'm trying to think if there is a good online one, because like I have a book that has a lot of that stuff. Where is it? I'm looking at my bookshelf. I can never remember what it's actually called. I know the artist or the author of it. I'll look it up. It's somewhere in here. I'll share that with you all. But so it really, there isn't any standard per se, because it comes down to what does your design want to achieve? What does it become? What do you want it to become? And then you're using those elements and principles to help create that goal, or to help achieve that goal. And then it comes down to the user and the user's experience and trying to imagine how you're using it to kind of dictate it. So a standard, it's really hard to really identify. But some of the things that we can use as simple, just like tips, would be, if you, going back to the textures, if you want something to be more intimate and decrease the scale, or make a larger space seem smaller, use more coarse textures, and use the fine textures to make the space seem a little bit larger. With regards to color, cool colors slow you down. They slow down, whereas the warmer colors create activity. So like a great example about warm colors is think of all those like big food chains, like Chili's, Applebee's, TGIF, Red Robin, you know, all those things. What's their predominant colors that they use throughout their restaurants?
Red.
Yeah, red. because what that does, it actually psychologically triggers you to eat more, but also you go at a quicker pace because warm colors evoke movement, whereas cool colors slow things down, and it actually can suppress your appetite. So they obviously they want to turn tables quickly and want people to spend more money, so they're going to use warm colors. So colors can evoke mood. So it really comes down to, there are some color theories that you can determine what colors you want, but again, it comes back to how you want that space to be perceived. So if you do want help with selection of what are some of these elements and how can I put them together to achieve these goals, I can help you pick those specifically, because a lot of that just comes with experience and just being more familiar with the tools. So I know doesn't really answer the question per se, but kind of targets us there, I guess. Any other questions about the elements and principles? All right, so let's go ahead and we'll talk about the drawing a landscape plan. So it's you're already at your inventory and analysis, and it really comes down to, okay, how do I just start drawing out some of my ideas, kind of understand, what's that function, what do you want that landscape to become? So like, remember last week we were talking about what's the big idea, what's your big goal, what do you want your landscape to become? That kind of, that concept functional plan, and that's what we're going to start working on. And we can start thinking about those drawing bed lines and locating trees. So we'll go through this process. And our goal for next week is to kind of have you come up with a concept functional plan. But if you can go a little bit further beyond that, that would be good. But so let's talk about that concept functional plan. So it comes down to just a bubble diagram, essentially. So you have your landscape plan, and based off of the inventory and analysis, you just start drawing quick little bubbles. Where do you want things to happen? As you can see, there's no plant selection that's happening here. So you can see, like, on here, that red on the backyard, want more privacy, bring in more color, shade and screen, excuse you, enclosure and screen. So you can kind of see that this is very loose idea, but it's just a matter of just like getting your ideas and trying to see how is that function of the landscape going to become. And one thing that's important is it shows circulation. How will people move around the garden? How do people get in the backyard? Is it through the house? Is it through the side yard? How will that movement occur? Because that can start creating your bed lines, essentially. So once you kind of come up with that concept and function plan based off of your idea of what you would like your landscape to become, that's when you can start drawing just like bed lines. So bed lines just kind of determine where do you want to put those ornamental spaces, and where do you want to have kind of like those void or open spaces. So it could be like a turf grass area. And some of you have already had this pretty much, or some of this already identified through your inventory and analysis. So some of the things that I really like to use for beds is, yes, strong formal geometric shapes can work really well within a residential yard, but typically we're seeing these very curvilinear natural flows. So it's important to think about when you're putting your beds onto a landscape. I usually try to think about how I'm using circles, and I connect them with tangent lines, or they're tangent together. Don't do like irregular squiggles. Think about if you're mowing a yard, what could you mow? Could you mow it easily with a lawnmower? Usually those big sweeps, those bigger curves are much easier maintained, and then your eye interprets them as well. There's a lot of times when people do very squiggly landscape design beds, but when it comes to actually seeing it on the landscape, you don't see it. You need big sweeping curves. And usually from the scale of a home, usually if you just say, think about those curves that you can easily do with like a push lawnmower, that's going to be important because it helps create those curves, or think about those broad curves. But also when you do have to maintain it, it allows you to make sure that you can easily get in and maintain areas. So putting the beds, like where do you want plants to be? This is where you can really start to identify, or you can start thinking about, what type of plants do I want to see within my landscape bed? So again, but you can still see in these images that we are still not really identifying the plant choices. No, we can be thinking about them, absolutely, but we're not identifying the plant choices yet. But some of the things that's important to point out is that none of the bed lines come in and hit the home or a hardscape at a very tight, like acute angle. Everything's coming in at like a right angle, or it might come in at like a little bit off of that, a few degrees off. But having bed lines come in at a right angle it ties that bed in a little bit more to that hardscape because it's so structured and formal. But also connecting garden beds, don't fragment them. And when I say that is like looking at this curve right here, you can see this big sweeping curve, and then you can see how it starts to curve back out. But if I was following this curve, it ties in very easily with that next bed. So your eye connects the dots between these two spaces, even though nothing is there. What I wouldn't do is like, say you have this bed come in here and then all of a sudden it comes out down here. Because then you have this weird space that happens right here. So you can see how, this lends itself to wanting to come across here. So tying beds in together like that is really nice. But you can see from looking at this, that they do have spaces that are larger spaces that are created, and these are these void spaces. Now, these could be turf grass if you're in full sun area. It could be other type of small ground covers, or if you're a really shady area, it could literally just be open mulch space that you have open for activity and use. So, and then also shallow beds. You don't want any beds to be less than 5 feet deep. You don't want beds planted right up against the house, or plants right up against the house. You need to give them a little space. So all foundation plantings are all minimum of 5 foot depth. Otherwise, don't have anything there. No plant bed there. So, and then you can have them as deep as you want. So, we go from, we went from the, I'm getting everything, I'm having technical issues. Okay, so we went from that like basic concept function plan, how's the plan gonna look? We went to, okay, next we're gonna draw plant beds and draw those plant beds. And that's where you kind of just really exploring the different ideas. Don't get stuck on one idea. Do a couple sketches, thinking about that function and that concept, and then put it aside. And then, sometimes I find if I literally just turn the page that I'm drawing on 180 degrees, I'm looking at it from a different perspective, and then I'll start to generate different ideas. The idea is to make sure that you're giving yourself opportunities to think about ideas so you don't get stuck on the same idea, because typically design, like I mentioned, it's a reiterative process. So you got to make sure you challenge yourself to try to think differently, to try to push that design until you're like, oh, you know what? This is a really good this is a very good summation. Like everything I've worked through, I thought about these different problems, my inventory and analysis. This, I really like this, so it kind of forces you to kind of push yourself to think, how far can I take my design? So once you kind of have that general idea of where you want those plant beds to be, you can really start to locate those different plants. And there's different types of plants. We have our structural plants, our focal points, those emphasis, and then massing plants. So structural plants, they help anchor. They kind of create a visual anchor around the landscape. Focal point plants, those are the things that you want people to look at. And massing plants are the plants that kind of start to tie everything a little bit better together. It's some of like the most common massing plants that we see all throughout our landscapes here in Alachua County is Kunti. I love Kunti. It's an amazing massing plant. You can put a bunch in and it kind of fills up a big bed, and it can help connect those different structural and focal points. So usually just identifying, okay, so you have your beds, what would be some of those structural trees? What would be some of those large plants that you would want? So in this image, like looking at these trees, I really like this one. So they can help define spaces. So you can see these 3 trees here are helping define this space. But then when those 3 trees in conjunction with these trees, they frame this view. So it blocks off what's happening here and here, and it channels your eye outward across the landscape, out towards that good view. So, and then some structural plants just kind of around the home, but you can see how you can use those trees to block unwanted views, emphasize good views, but it also can kind of become justification for some why you have trees in your ornamental bed. If you have existing large trees that are just in your turf grass, it could be a great way to pull your plant bed out. Can it incorporate those trees into that planted bed? Because it does make it easier for maintenance. So the structural plants, and we have focal points. So what do you want people to look at? So what is that view from that front door? You know, what do people see? Or from the back door, what do people see? So from this back patio, or where the seating area is, whoops, some of the focal points is there can be like an arbor or a trellis, or it could be maybe a climbing vine that climbs up a trellis, or it could be just unique plant material that specifically you select to grab people's attention. So it's putting those focal points out in the landscape. And then the third is those massing plants, and that's just kind of, you fill in the gaps. And that's where you really get your diversity of plant material. And you can see that it's just these bubbles. The bubbles throughout those plant beds just kind of fill in those gaps. And that's where you can like put Kunti, African iris, you can bring in any plant that you really like. And to help really start to define those spaces. We're talking about unity. Having repeated massing plants throughout a design will help create unity throughout the entire design in itself. So massing plants are great. So if you had like, so I can't remember off the top of my head, I think it's 10 plants. Greg, is it 10 plants for the Florida friendly recognition minimum?
Minimum, yes.
Okay, so yeah, you could have 10 massing plants or 10 plants that you use, and you just repeat them strategically throughout the design, and it kind of creates unity throughout that landscape. And what I usually do is at this point, I might start identifying maybe what some of the plants I like or some ideas that I do have. But sometimes I will literally just think of what's the plant I would like to see here. I describe the plant and then I find the plant later. I imagine what do I want it to look like? And then it's like, I'll find a plant that grows, that's the right plant in the right place that fits that condition and what I would like to see. So this is usually where I end. I don't typically go beyond this too terribly much. So like I'll do my concept, I kind of generate like what's my layout, you know, where do my plant beds go? I put my structural plants in, those focal points, and then I bring in my massing plants. And this is where I will end. I'll take most of my landscape designs here and then I'll stop here unless I'm contracted out to do so. But after you get to that point, oops, come on, here we go. That's when you can start selecting your plant material, is really start to identifying, okay, what are the plants I really want to have? You know, you're going to already have some available to you or that you already have picked or in your mind.
We're going to buy at the Master Garden plant sale.
Yeah, so that's at the plant sale. So the materials that you all have, like I gave you all the online, we looked at the app. This is the great way to just, you can type in those environmental conditions and it'll show which plants grow well in those environmental conditions. So you can select the right plant for the right place. Because I usually, like I mentioned, is like I'm thinking about plants as I'm when I'm starting to get to this point, but I'm not going to ID them correct all the way. You know, I'll start to think, okay, what are those other good plants that I think would go well in contrast to these other plants? So I kind of go back and forth a little bit, but ultimately it's not till the very end when I really, okay, I finally figured out what my plants are, and that's usually the last thing that I do. So, and then you can come up with something like this. This is a preliminary planting plan. You don't have to do this. So all those little circles, that is like a rough way to determine how many of those plants you need to buy. So last week I showed you all that circle template that I use. If I'm really trying to get very precise, I will draw the plants with those circle templates to determine my plant count. And when we select these, and we base them off of their mature size, not the size that you put them in the ground. So, because remember, I said plants do this cool thing called grow. So this is when we really get to that. I want you to design, start thinking about your design. And for next week, I want you at minimum to be at this point. Because if you can get to this point, you're at the foundation of a full Florida-friendly landscape design. You're at the foundation of completing any successful landscape design. Because what you've done when you get to this concept or functional plan is you've thought about the landscape, you thought about how it's going to be used, you thought about how it could be laid out. And then it's very easy to start thinking about, okay, now how do I walk through that last part of selecting plant beds and locating those plants in the landscape. Now, if you feel more comfortable kind of getting through some of this, like, you know, even if it's just really rough and conceptual, where it's, here's where my beds, here's some of the plants, here's some of the plants I'm thinking about, that would even be better. So my goal, again, so next week, our goal is to kind of get you to at least at minimum this point. And one thing I want to do is, you know, we're thinking about how do we create a Florida-friendly landscape. It really comes back to that right plant, right place. But we do have that recognition process in if you meet certain benchmarks or you achieve certain criteria, you can actually have your landscape recognized as a Florida-friendly landscape. So what I'm going to send to you all is a copy of, or general copy of that checklist that you can use to kind of say, am I achieving this guide or this certain criteria in my landscape design, to kind of help lead that decision making to help get you to a designed Florida friendly landscape. Any questions about this? You all feel comfortable enough where you think that you can start to say, I want to start putting some ideas on a piece of paper?
I think so.
I think so. Yeah. It's kind of started.
So, Mary, you were going to say something? Did I see you about to say something a second ago?
I'm just thinking about, I was looking at the window here and see, I've just got so much stuff. I've got to get some of it out of there so I can get a feel for what I do want.
Yeah. Sometimes it's nice just to, you know, don't go outside with your plans. Don't go outside in the garden with thinking about the work that you have to do in the landscape. Just go out in the garden and just walk around and experience it. Like truly experience it, because it's really hard to not walk through the garden and pull weeds, Nikki. I can guarantee that's what you do. But just go out there and just experience it and see. And then that's going to kind of just get you thinking about your landscape more. And then it'll start to open up more doors and how comfortable you feel doing certain things. And your design could literally be adding, how do I add certain massing plants to help tie everything together? Or what are some good emphasis plants I can put, or focal points that I can put out here to help add some visual quality? So you don't have to start over from square one, but at least get you thinking about what are some of these design techniques that you can use to improve the design you already have.
I have a question.
Yes. Yeah, was that Judy?
On on the property that I'm working on there. Hi, it's Judy. Can you hear me?
Yes, your audio is
Yes.
delayed.
Hello? Can you hear? Big trees in the front with an ancient sprawling creeping juniper that I'd like to take out, but I think that getting the roots out is going to be difficult. How do you deal with something like that practically?
So
I'm going to have all of these roots probably. I need to cover it with heaps of soil.
no, well,
in order to
that'll
ground
end up
cover?
killing it. That'll end up killing it. Sometimes you can interspace them within the roots. It gets really, really tough when you have a dense root system. Sometimes they're completely removed and replaced out of ease of adding new plants. Otherwise, you're stuck in trying to pocket them in where you can in the dense cover, and just putting a ground cover in that's really good at sprawling and spreading, so it helps fill in all the other gaps.
And how would that affect the big trees if I'm putting 6 inches of a berm forming around the roots I can't get out on the juniper?
If you build up soil, you're going to kill the tree. So if you add, you shouldn't add any soil above the structural roots of a tree. Even if they're at the surface, if you put even upwards of 4 inches of soil, topsoil on top of a tree root that's already established, it could end up killing it. It suffocates it and it can't get oxygen, etc.
So I can't recreate the form that the juniper was supposed to have by berming around that, berming along that.
Correct.
Between the trees and around. Okay, back to square one.
If you want to, Judy, you can, because I know that's something you've been working on, you can bring that to me or send it to me and bring some of those ideas. So I want to show you all something. I'm going to stop share real quick. I want to show you something. So like one of the most successful landscape designers in the world, well, I think he is. And I know like Greg and Nikki, you've probably heard me talk about him before, but he's this Dutch man named Piet Dolf. And let me show you his.
I just read a great article in Flower Magazine on him.
So do you see that?
Oh,
That's all his designs are.
all right.
That's all it is. It's all just squiggles. So he just understands and knows the plant material so well. But you know, when you're talking about, when you see like these crazy illustrative designs, you know, that like landscape architecture firms will do, that they use, that's to get client contracts. That's to help get them to hire you. When you're already hired, this is typically what you're going to see. But it just goes to show you that when we're thinking about one of the best or most notable landscape designers of our time, that this is the plans, the types of plans that he uses. I mean, you all can still see this, can't you? Just my Google search.
Oh, yeah, that's it. Yeah, I love this guy's
So
work. I've seen this.
That just goes to show you that like that concept and functional plan, thinking of like that circulation and those bed lines, you can do everything from there. His just really comes down to, of course, this is what his looks like.
Yeah.
So
That can't be right. Somebody had to have photoshopped that.
So yeah.
Yeah.
So he's just that good. So But that's because his intimate knowledge of plant material. So, and he uses a lot of perennials and
He loves
grasses.
the grasses. And it's funny because my husband loves the grasses and I'm always like, and then he saw one of my magazines with that guy stuffing it. He's like, look at this guy loves the grass. I'm like,
So your goal for this week is just at minimum get here, try to push yourself further. Because next week, what I want us to do is have each of you kind of just present, talk about your plans and your ideas so you can get feedback from everybody. And then that'll allow you to, at the end of next week's program, be at that point where it's like, I feel confident in my design and I can get through this design. And of course, when the program ends, you can always still reach out to me to get feedback on that design. But what I want us to do is try to get to at minimum this point. If you can go further, that would be awesome. Do you all feel overwhelmed by it? Today was just data dump. I know, but I don't want you to feel overwhelmed, because what I gave you, those elements and principles, it's like, cool. You know, those are really nice, but really when it comes down to it, you design what you want. You're designing it for yourself. You know, these elements and principles are just ways that like professionals use to make sure that they can communicate with one another. But ultimately, you're designing what you want to create, and that's the biggest thing that matters. So, all righty.
Good. Yeah. No, I appreciate it. Thank you.
So, and I'm trying to get Gail in here next week. So Gail Hansen, she's one of our extension. She works in extension. She's a state specialist in sustainable design. She's my mentor. So I'm trying to see if she can join us next week to help have discussion and give some discussion points. So
nice.
Cool.
But anyways, so I do have the last minute. I'll stop share. And let me stop recording.